Welcome to Orisha Faith Today podcast, where I talk about various topics on the Orisha religion in the 21st century, shedding light on ancient beliefs, contemporary issues. The opinions I give in this podcast are my own, and only my own, as I represent no formal organization, entity, or church. I am Meko Oshailu, an Obatala devotee, an Oriete, an all-around curious guy, ever seeking more knowledge and wisdom in our faith. Not sure what episode I'm up to. I believe this is episode 3 of this podcast. And today's topic is going to be how Yemaya became an Orisha of the oceans. My aim in making this podcast is to foster better understanding between practitioners of Lukumi and traditional Yoruba religions. Particularly on this topic, it seems to be one that there's been a bit of debate over the years, and sometimes it leads to some tensions. There's already a lot of information on the subject available in print and online, but I hope to sort of present the information in a way that addresses sort of the belief differences, the theological differences between the two traditions, and hopefully foster sort of a better mutual understanding and a mutual respect between the two. Oftentimes I see there's people of each tradition being dismissive of the other. The Lukumi will say, no, Yemaya was never a river deity, and you're never going to change my mind about that. And then you'll see traditionalists say, well, the Lukumi are just wrong and don't know what they're talking about. And mind you, not all, and quite frankly, not even most. Um, but the few that are still out there, with that back and forth, tend to be the loudest. So I hope to present a lot of information for your consideration, give you something to think about, maybe even disagree with me about. Um, and if you don't want to listen to the whole podcast, I'll summarize it this way. Both traditions are right. And if you think that's a cop out, then listen to the whole episode. I'm hoping you'll enjoy it. So, the order I'm going to present it in is first I'm going to start with Nigeria. Start with what I know about Nigeria and Yemaya worship there. With the caveat, I've never been there. All my information is through traditional practitioners, books, reading, research. And then from there, I'll go and speak about the Cuban Lukumi tradition, which that I do have personal experience, a couple years studying that, maybe a little bit more than a couple. And then it's gonna be then after I present a lot of the facts, I'm also going to analyze those facts, and honestly, it's gonna be a bit of conjecture, and let you analyze my theories, and hopefully get some feedback from you. So let's start with Orisha Yemaya devotion in Nigeria. Okay, so first of all, it goes without saying that the the devotion to Yemaya is based largely in um, Oyo region, Ogun State region, and in Nigeria, Yemaya is or Yemaja is very clearly associated with a river. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And so, with the Lukumi practitioner in mind, I want to clarify a couple things, right? So, in Lukumi, Ochun is the owner of all rivers, Yemaya of all oceans, alongside with the local. Nigeria, it's a little bit different. So, Oshun is the owner of Oshun River, not all rivers in the world, very specifically Oshun River. And so there's also a tributary river called Oba River, and guess who's the Orisha who dominates that? Oba. There's Oya River. Guess who dominates Oya River? Oya. You may know it better as the Niger River. And then there's a river called the Ogun River, and it stretches through Ogun State from Oyo through Ogun State, and it ends in Lagos. And Lagos, given its name by the Portuguese, meaning lake, and that lake empties into the ocean. But for the most part, Yemaya's portion is the river. Now, how does Yemaya get associated with a river named Ogun? Well, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but as you may know, Yoruba is a phonetic language, which means the intonation you give a word can and often does change the meaning. So, if I say Ogun one way, I'm talking about the deity, the Orisha. If I say Ogun a different way, I may be talking about medicine. I say it a different way, I may be talking about war. And so the Ogun River, the way it is properly pronounced, actually means medicine. So it is the river of healing. It is, and so it's not necessarily associated with Ogun, the god of war. So the river of healing, the river of medicine in Nigeria, in Yoruba land, is actually associated with none other than Yemaja. Okay, it's her river. In fact, one of the very well-known stories is that Yemaya became the river. So it's not like she found the river and laid claim. They're saying that her between a fight, her either she fought with Okere or she fought with Aganju. The different versions, but at the end of that story, in her sadness, she falls to the ground and becomes the Ogun River. And ever since that day, human beings have been worshipping her at that river. Okay, so when we say that the Ogun River belongs to Yemaya, it's because the Ogun River is actually Yemaya. It's her there. And so over there, it's not really a question. And so the reason why it's called the river of medicine because those waters are said to be healing and they can give life. It is agbo, right? Medicine. And Ogun. And so the Yemaya devotees, they have their festival there every year. Throughout the year, they go make their salutations to that river. Uh, People bathe in that river for health. There's fishing in that river. Um, and so it's pretty well understood. Now, how big is the river? It's not a small river. Okay, it's not. It's actually an enormous, enormous river. I tried to do calculating and comparisons. I'm probably gonna get it a little wrong, but when comparing on my maps, I got approximately 250 kilometers, give or take. And I tried to give a comparison. If you're in the United States, it's like going from New York City to Baltimore, give or take a few miles, right? And that's not including all the winds and bends and curves that a river takes, right? I'm thinking just straight lines here. If you were to stretch Ogun River out, it'd be even larger. And Ogun River is shallow at some points, but it is actually, for the most part, big enough and wide enough to be a significant commercial transport um, body of water. And as you know, going by boat for trade is a lot more convenient than walking on land. And so, especially between Abeokuta and Lagos, that river has always been a huge commercial outlet. Not to mention all the fishing that goes on in the Ogun River. And so when you hear of Yemaja, associated with being a businesswoman, being good in commerce, one thing you have to realize that this is directly tied with her association with that river. How to this day, if you don't believe me, check out a Google Images on how many boats, large boats. Well, I'm not talking canoes here. I'm talking real modern, large-sized commercial boats fit in this river, sometimes many at a time, and they can transport back and forth. And so then you'll understand how and why Yemaya is associated with commerce. Um, and and so that part is pretty straightforward. And so, what is the principal word for river in Yoruba language? Odo, right? And we're gonna get a little bit more into the vocabulary later, right? But now I wanted to jump over to Cuba and just lay out just facts before we get into any interpretation. Just lay out some more facts, and then we'll get into the interpretation. So in Cuba, it is unequivocal that Yemaya is considered an ocean deity, right? We have countless individual offerings a year. When I say countless, I mean Yemaya is a very, very important deity to the Lukumi faith. She's huge for us. And so when I say people go to the ocean often to pray to Yemaya, it's it's an understatement. And when I say often, I should be saying something like very often. And then you have the yearly festival, the yearly celebration of Yemaya, which coincides with the celebration of Virgen de Regla. And you have people that make um, offerings in mass on, in large numbers on that day. Uh, Yemaya has an exalted place in our faith, and it's not really contested. That's also so. So then the question becomes, right? How did that happen? Where did the change happen? So, and even before we get to that, another thing that we have to consider is that if you go to Brazil, now Brazil has a very similar history to Cuba, in that it was a colony. Instead of being a Spanish colony, it was a Portuguese colony. They also imported men and women as slaves. They, those men and women recreated the religion as best as they could. And one interesting thing, one similarity that's worth noting is that both Cuba and Brazil consider Yemaya an ocean deity. And so this is really, really important, because there must have been something that triggered this, even though there's a couple of thousand miles between those two people, right? Was there some communication between the two, or were there already existing elements that led to sort of this conclusion? Okay, so I want you to think about, if you can, if you had a computer, open up your Google Maps, look at Cuba, and look at the two areas that were the principal, that are the two principal cities for Orisha devotion, right? And you're gonna have Havana and Matanzas, without a doubt, the two main areas. And one thing you'll notice about them, that they are coastal. They are not landlocked. They are not insular. They are coastal. You will also notice that that plenty of rivers run through both. And this is going to be very important. As I said earlier, now I'm going to start getting into my speculation, into my interpretation here. Okay, so just imagine it, right? You have to undergo the horror of being captured. You're on a boat, and you arrive in this new city. You're put to work, and you're in a new place, and you see a river, but you know it's not the same river, or you see a couple rivers, and you know they're not the same rivers from back home, obviously, because you're not home. And so obviously you don't just randomly assign, right? Remember before when I said Yemaja is the Ogun River, and the Ogun River is Yemaya? It's not just a symbolic, um, you know, it's not just a symbolic association. So you can't really necessarily do things arbitrarily, and when you're recreating your belief system in a new place, there has to be consensus amongst other worshippers, right? You don't want to have some disharmony, some discord. And so what happens in Cuba, so instead of Ochun being the goddess of the Ochun River, in Cuba, she became the goddess of all rivers. Now, there is a caveat. Anybody who studies also knows about Olokun and Olosa having their place in the rivers too. But for this conversation, let's keep it with Ochun and Yemaya for now. So, so in Cuba, it became that all rivers belong to Ochun. Remember, none of those rivers are the Ochun River that the original, people who were brought over would have known. They would have known that they're replicating the faith, and so they had to make some changes, and they had to assign new bodies of water to these deities. And so one of the decisions that became a consensus as a people was that all rivers would belong to Ochun. That way, if you had to do your ceremony in Havana or you had to do your ceremony in Matanzas, you could remain consistent. Could you imagine if you started naming the different rivers to different orishas in a new land, and you didn't have the freedom to go here or there? Well, I mean, what would you do, right? And and the other thing, I spoke a bit already about how the Ogun River is a river of a lot of finance and commerce. Now, just so you know, the Ochun River in Nigeria isn't as lucky, right? The Oya River, the Niger River is, right? But the Oshun River, well, let me not put it that way, because the Oshun River is so blessed, right? And to this day, it draws worshippers and non-worshippers alike from all parts of the world. The blessings that come from the Oshun River are immeasurable. But as far as commerce goes, it just doesn't do it because it doesn't have the depth to hold the larger boats, right? You, right? In order to be a good commercial river, it has to have very, very long stretches where it's deep enough to carry large boats, and Ochun River just isn't that way. So as far as commerce, it doesn't have the same reputation. Yeah, you can go short distances, but it doesn't compare to the Ogun in that respect. Okay, so so what happens? So in Cuba, when we think about the association with the body of water and commerce, right now we're talking about groups of people, Havana and Matanzas, both in coastal areas. Now, just think about the economy of the 17th and 18th century, right? How did Cuba become rich? They didn't, eat all their own sugar and smoke all their own tobacco and drink all their own rum. No, they were exporting. They were exporting to other countries. That's how Cuba, as Spain, through Cuba and then Cuba on its own, was making their wealth. They were exporting the goods that they produce, just like any economy wants to do. And when you're going to export, how do you export? You export by sea. And therefore, people living in coastal cities like Havana and Matanzas would become to associate the commerce from the ocean to Yemaya. In Cuba, Yemaya is very much associated with commerce, mostly through the path of Mayalewu, right? As being a great marketplace woman. And everybody also knows that Oya is very big in commerce too. But there's no doubt that Ochun as well, but mostly Yemaya is very much associated with this commerce. And and so here's my speculation, here's my theory, is that the commerce associated with the Ogun River got translated to the commerce and the prosperity then associated with the ports in Havana and Matanzas. Okay? this is where the commerce was happening. This is, where the merchandise, the rum, the sugar cane, the tobacco was getting loaded. This is where goods were coming in. This is where the hustle and bustle was. And so you couldn't assign specific rivers to specific Orisha. And on top of that, the 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 commercial aspect of the ocean got translated to Yemaya, and it seems like a natural progression. And if you think about it, in the Lukumi system, what you had was a lot of people who were worshippers of different orishas essentially coming together and making a single priesthood. Now, yes, you could still get initiated to specific orisha, but ultimately everybody's undergoing the same initiation and receiving more or less at the same time uh, the same orisha. They go home with the same orisha, and they have priestly powers over all the orisha. So even if you get initiated into a batala, once your year and 7 days are up, you still have authority to act as a priest in Yemaya ritual, in Ochun ritual, in Chango ritual, right? So it became a single priesthood. Unlike in Nigeria, each one was separate, and they had their own shrines and they had their own temples. You didn't have that in Cuba. You had your cabildos, that's a whole different story. But essentially, the initiation became a single priesthood for everybody. And so when you think about it, there had to be creating a single priesthood. You had to sort of reallocate the Orisha's jobs in a way, right? Um, so, like, when you speak to some Nigerian devotees, worshippers, right, you'll see the ones that are like Oshun worshippers, right? They'll give credit to Oshun for certain things. And then you speak to some Yemaja worshippers, and they'll say, well, they're giving Yemaja credit that for things that the Oshun worshippers gave their Orisha credit for. And so there's this overlap, right? There's a certain amount of overlap in what they do. For example, even cowrie divination in Cuba, both versions exist. Who was the first one to throw cowries? Was it Oshun? Was it Yemaya? Yeah, there's even a third one that was about the law, but I won't even touch that one. But both versions arrived in Cuba, and if you go to Nigeria, yeah, they believe that too. The Yemaya priestess will pull towards Yemaya, and the Oshun priestess will pull towards Oshun as far as who was the first. So there's this overlap, right? So what happens when this all becomes one priesthood? Okay, you got to kind of sort things out, right? You can't have one person, right? One group of people telling what appears at first to be contradictory information. So everybody sort of got their place. And so Oshun got rivers, Yemaya got ocean, specifically the upper part of the ocean. Oya got the cemetery or the gate of the cemetery. You know, um, Olosa got the lakes. Nana Buruku got the swamps, right? And so everybody was allocated to their specific regions, okay, without taking into account that in Nigeria they may have shared some of those same qualities, right? In Cuba, no, everybody had their own distinct place, and that's really important to understanding how things happen. And you have to understand it wasn't a lack of understanding on their part. They knew very well what it was, but they also knew very well what had to be, okay, for the new environment. And and honestly, when we talk about the ashe of commerce on an island of Cuba, if you are in a coastal city, then yes, then the ocean is more relevant to you as far as trade goes than the local rivers that may or may not bring merchandise from the inner towns just to the coast, right? But the real money was being exchanged at the coast anyway, right? So that's really important. It's a difference in the economies, and therefore a difference in how the orishas were interpreted in their new places. So, what are some of the other things that could have lent to Yemaja being associated with the the ocean as opposed to the river? Well, I mentioned a little while back that Ogun River empties into Lagos, right, the lake, and Lagos essentially spills out into the ocean, right, and that there is sort of a distinction, right, and so another that tends to confuse traditional practitioners about Lukumi religion is our really tight association between Yemaya and Olokun, right? Over there, it doesn't seem to be as strong of a connection, right? So obviously, the word Olokun means owner of the ocean. In Cuba, if you're from the Fermina Gomez line, your Olokun is female. If you follow Ile Ife, Yoruba practice, your Olokun is female. A lot of places in Oyo and Oshogbo, for the most part, Olokun is female. If you go to places like Benin City, some parts of Lagos, Olokun is male. But right now, that's not even the topic of this particular talk. What I want to address is first the fact that the Ogun River empties into Lagos, which then empties into the ocean, and B, the Olokun worship in Lagos, right? So, so what happens is, so let me tell you the one of the very important stories of Ile Ife. Okay, remember, if you don't know, Ile Ife is considered the cradle of Yoruba civilization. It's actually considered the center of the earth. It's our Eden. It's the beginning of humanity. It's the beginning of civilization in our faith, right? There's one very important story that that Odudua, representing, the earth, married Olokun, representing the ocean, and from their marriage they could not produce children. Okay, and in shame, Olokun decided to leave Ile-Ife to allow Odudua to, procreate, which would then be with Osara, Osara, which it's also called Olosa. And so the story is that Olokun goes away from Ileife, which is inland, travels to the shore, and becomes the ocean or becomes one with the ocean, depending on the version. Okay, and but one thing that said that Olokun left Odudua prematurely. And by the way, for those of you who are students of Ifa and Dilogun, just consider the story of Unleodi or Obedi for a second, right? While I say this story, and you'll have an aha moment right there. So anyway, so Olokun goes, and so the story goes that she actually was in fact pregnant. Had she just waited around a little bit longer, she would have realized that she was pregnant. Although another version says that God Almighty, Olodumare, had pity on Olokun and decided to, even though she left, to bless her with a child. So anyway, in the ocean, when Olokun would give birth to that child, she called that child Agana. And so because Olokun had distanced herself from Ileife, um, she would never go there directly. However, she would send her daughter Agana as her spokesperson to Ileife. And to this day, there is an Agana festival. I don't know if it's in Lagos, I don't know if it's in Ife, I forget right now. Uh, but in honor of the communication, because Odudua was never mad at Olokun, there was no fight. And, Olokun was sort of more of ashamed more than anything. And so there was no reason. So So this the yearly tribute and the respect Oduduwa had for Olokun is always there. And please keep in mind, this is just one version that I'm telling you. I've read several, so if the one you heard happens to be a little bit different, don't like go off in the comment section. Um, so, so now, if you are a Lukumi practitioner, right there, you're going to hopefully you're getting a lot of bells going off in your head, right? There's a lot of light bulbs going off, right? Right now, you might be thinking, "Oh snap! Olokun is not speaking directly to Ileife. Olokun is speaking through Agana to Ileife." What happens in Cuba? In Cuba, Olokun won't speak with her own shells. She speaks through the shells of Yemaya, right? So wait, but what does Agana have to do with Yemaya? That's what a Yoruba traditionalist would say. They have nothing to do with each other. In Nigeria, Agana is not Yemaya. That is true. However, in Cuba, uh, in Cuba, Agana was converted into one of the many manifestations of Yemaya. And upon Agana being incorporated as to one of the what we call paths or caminos of Yemaya, then the association of Yemaya as a whole to Olokun became cemented. Okay? So one of the paths of Yemaya in Cuba is Ibu Agana. And it is a matter of fact. And Agana in Cuba is considered the path of Yemaya, mostly close associated with Olokun. One of the praise names for Olokun in Cuba is Aganaeri. Okay? So so the details change a bit, but the root survived very well intact to this day. It just takes a little bit of contemplation to appreciate, the kind of the new tree that has come out of that root, right? It's still the same tree, it just looks a little different. And if you look at it in this light, it's almost impossible to deny it, right? It's almost impossible to deny. And you can say, well, that was a wrong interpretation. Well, you know what? It was their interpretation, and that's what we've received today. And I'm not exactly unhappy about it. So I think that's a very very strong indicator of what happened there. Um, what else? What else is there? Another aspect is that we have to consider is the Arara, the Dahomeans in Cuba. Now, off the bat, I tend to you get two camps of people um, with these discussions, right? The people who accept the organic intermixing of people and that yep, there was some exchange of ideas and then you have your people who want to artificially keep things pure and you have to separate things at all cost, yada yada yada. So before I go into the specifics of Yemaya and the Arara, which I don't know if I said it, but they're the Arara are the Dahomey practitioners of how they survived in Cuba. The Vodun, they call them Fodun. Um, so just so you know, Oduduwa had 7 grandsons. Later stories would change that number to 16, but Oduduwa would have 7 grandsons, and those 7 grandsons would establish kingdoms on their own. Of those 7, 3 are located in modern day Dahomey, right? Um, Modern day Benin. So before, and I know that these borders were made by Europeans, but don't think that there wasn't a lot of intermixing in the old country before they came over. before they were brought over to Cuba. There sure was, and you can actually go there and you can see, you can actually see some of these mixing. You see, for example, in Ketu, they'll use for the word for the ancestors, they'll they'll use egungun and kuvito interchangeably. One is a Fungbe word, one is a Yoruba word, and these are the same group of people using both words interchangeably, right? You have worshippers that can speak both languages. So, so when I talk about what happened in Cuba, don't just dismiss it as an invento, an invention of Cubans that didn't understand what they were talking about, right? This goes from the way back. But this particular mix, I think, is specifically Cuban. So we have a bit of a chicken and the egg dilemma. So in Cuba, Yemaya, Yemoja, is syncretized, is associated most closely with the Arara, the Feng deity called Afrequete. And you'll even hear in some, not in some, in many, many, many drummings, while they're singing to Yemaya, they'll slip right in to to the Homang Arara songs for Afrequete. Um, it happens all the time. In fact, they've even adapted the Arara rhythm to the Bata drums, right? There's no secret about this. This is very common practice among us, and so so now here's the thing. When we examine Afrequete more closely, you can do this if you're in front of a computer. Do it right now. Spell Afrequete the following way: Avlkete. Put that in Google Maps, and you're gonna see a coastal region in Dahomey, a coastal city in Dahomey called Avlequete. Okay, and it is named after the deity of the city, Avlequete. There is, without a doubt, that Avlequete is not a river deity. Avlequete is an ocean deity. You can study it all you want. So then the question becomes, did Yemaya become an ocean deity because she was influenced by the Avlequete connection? Or had she already been interpreted as an ocean deity and therefore it made it easier to connect her to Avlequete, right? Did both happen more or less at the same time, and therefore both these things mutually fed off each other and cemented? I don't know. I wasn't there, but those are both two very, very plausible and, quite frankly, likely explanations, right? Um, and it goes without a doubt that we have to consider that. And just so you understand, let's talk about timing, right? So you had a lot of Yoruba and Dahomeans being brought to Cuba through the whole period of the transatlantic slave trade, but you had a very serious uptick in the early 19th century, early 1800s, right? And to be honest, the French and the English, they really put their guys in power, the people who would support them. And so what happened, you had what's called the Patricidal Wars, and it was a big hot mess, and it actually led to the fall of the Oyo Empire, because at the end of the day, they convinced the Oyos to essentially fight against themselves and close down all the trade routes because there was too much war going on, right? So yeah, so the colonialism really beat up Africa pretty bad. They're still feeling the effects today, but one of the things that would happen is the Homayans would fight against the Oyo, and the Oyo would fight against the Dahomayans, and they would capture each other's people as prisoners of war. Remember, at this point, there's no unified concept of Africa, right? These guys, they probably didn't like each other before, and they like each other less now, and they're just capturing each other's in there, whatever. And so anyway, so what happens is, so you have these both of these ethnic groups now in Cuba, now trying to get along, mixing quite a bit. to some extent staying separate, but you can see if you actually go into the nitty gritty um, of the worship, you actually see quite a bit of Dahomean influence in Lukumi, and you definitely see a lot of Yoruba influence in the Arara. There's no doubting it, right? And so that we have to take that with some serious consideration that might have been a very strong contributing factor. And the last thing that I'm going to get into is the language. I am not a linguist by any stretch of the imagination, but I know a little bit of vocabulary. So now, in Yoruba, right, the main word for river, the most common word for river is Odo, right? And I could be pronouncing it wrong. Remember I told you about phonetic language, right? Odo could also be the motor that you crush food in, right? Epilon, right? The thing that Shango sits on, that's Odo as well, right? But for the sake of this conversation, we're talking about the one that means river, Odo. And then you have the word for stream, which is Ibu, right? And so a lot of the streams feed essentially are tributaries of rivers, right? So you have Ibus and you have Odos. Sometimes you can use them interchangeably. You know, maybe there's a difference in opinion. Is that river really big enough to be an Odo? No, it's an Ibu. I don't know. But so what happens? So if Odo is river, then can we examine Lukumi songs to sort of further the idea that the Yoruba in Cuba, the Lukumi, did in fact understand the whole Yemaya as a river deity at one time and kept it alive, just not in the Spanish language. They kept it alive in the Lukumi language, um, but not but not in Spanish. Not when speaking in their regular vernacular did they express these ideas. So the answer is yes, of course, right? So um, Yemaya e olodo awoyo Yemaya, and of course there's also Yemaya olodo awalodo mio, Yemaya olodo awalodo mio, and I can probably find I'm doing this off the top of my head, uh, probably another half dozen if I really thought about it for Yemaya that really calls her the owner of a river, right? Very very clearly calls her. Now I've actually brought this up with Lukumi elders, and so the Lukumi language, the way it's interpreted today, has some caveats, right? Some nuance, right? So so when I brought this up, it says, well, no, in Cuban Lukumi, Odo actually means the deepness, the depth, Depth, right? So when we call Yemaya Olodo, we're calling Yemaya the owner of the deep, which is in regards to her position in the ocean. Only Ibu means river, Odo means deep. So, um, well, the generation before ours, maybe two generations ago, they didn't have all the uh, study material and access to stuff that we do. But even in that answer, you can sort of even internally, without going into any books or anything, you can still prove it wrong, right? By our own definition, we have to be able to accept that it is not necessarily right. So for example, let's say that Ibu is the only word for river, and let's just take that, and I'll tell you why. Even internally, we contradict ourselves because at the end of the day, we call all the paths of Yemaya Ibu, Ibu Agana, Ibu Asesu. In fact, I think there's a song. I think Lázaro Ross sings it. Ibu Asesu Olomidara, Ibu Achaba Olomidara. It's a song for Lokum, but it's saying the paths of Yemaya, right? To start it off. So we're referring to the names of Yemaya with the word Ibu, right? So even if Ibu is the only word for river, then we still have attested to in Lukumi that Yemaya is a river deity. At least we've preserved it, even if in our vernacular we don't say it. The other thing is, well, we can examine Odo as well. So let's look at Ochun. Ochun, we're pretty much convinced that that Ochun owns rivers and her home is in the river. And so one of the common songs to Ochun are sung differently by different people. It's the rezo, the prayer. So Iyami le oro. You have people that say oro, like ORO. So Iyami, my mother of the house of ritual, right? Because that's what oro is, right? Um, unless you're trying to creolize it and mean gold, but I don't think anybody has ever, made that made that claim. So oro is ritual. Like for example, you're gonna do Chango Oro Agayu. You're doing the Chango ritual on behalf of Agayu, right? So it's the Oro. Or, which makes a lot more sense, Yemaya Ochun, whose home is the river. Yamile Odo. Right? If you're singing a praise to Ochun, which of the two would you think is the more likely praise at that moment, right? Ileodo, right? Home who's in the river. So if we're gonna use Odo as river for Oshun, then 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 when we use Odo to talk about Yemaya, we have to acknowledge that it might possibly mean the same thing. So I actually brought that up as well, and well, no, the rivers can get deep too, and so therefore we're talking that Ochun is the owner of the deep, in regards to the deepness of the river, because there's a secret world, a mystical world, even under the river floor, and that's true. That's part of the mythologies, and there's no denying that that's true. But is that what Odo means? Is it what Odo really means? And I think that when we look at the all the evidence, when we look at all the evidence, it doesn't. And so with that, I'm basically wrapping it up. And to summarize, I hope that what everybody got out of this is that it's okay to learn something new. Put that as part of your mental repertoire. I'm almost certain that nothing I said here would change the way anybody practices. Right? Our practice always. I've known this information for years now. It hasn't changed the way I do anything. Okay. Um, but having more information as opposed to having less information is always better, right? Even if you don't agree with the information, even if you don't act on the information, at very least you have it. And at least when somebody comes to you with information or with a belief that's opposite of yours or whatever, you are now hopefully a little better prepared to engage that person in brotherly conversation, and talking things out, as opposed to fighting, bickering, and the such. So with that, until next episode, please like this podcast, please share it along, and let me get those likes later.